will look like with all the uncertainties that are looming in the air at the moment. All in all, we have roughly an hour. It's going to be 50 minutes from now. And again, please make use of the chance to ask Daniel any questions that you may have. Daniel, welcome to TOA on Air.
Hey, hello to everybody, and thanks for having me. It's really a great ending of the week to have a cool discussion with you guys. And quick note in advance: today is working from home day, and if there is some noise in the back, it's my little one. So maybe you even get the chance to see him. Let's see. So looking forward to starting, Nico.
Thanks, Daniel. So let's start, I thought, with a little bit on your personal background and the path to co-founding a company that has grown at tremendous speed. And maybe you want to share or can share some data points as to how fast and how big this company has grown. I read that now over 100 million people have actually traveled with your services throughout Europe.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Basically, this year is a little bit uncertain, so let's see how many million it'll be this year. But in 2009, it was more than 60 million already, and usually it's becoming more and more. Due to Corona, and we'll touch base on that later a little, obviously less people but this year, but overall, it has been more than 100 million, you're right. And we were able to move them around throughout more than 2,500 destinations in more than 30 countries. So it's quite a bit. It's not even only a German company any longer, but it's even a European or worldwide company, as we serve also the US or Turkey. And we do that with 400,000 trips a day. Well, we started on with our services back in 2013. That was in February when the first bus hit the road, and obviously before being live, we had to prepare, the company for almost 2 years from the back on the envelope idea until we've seen our first buses. And the cool thing is, not only the global expansion, but also that we were able to expand throughout different modes of transportation. And we really fell in love last year when we had the chance to start our first Flix trains. And what I read in the newspapers yesterday is we even have some cabrio services we launched recently in Germany, while around Berlin, someone took an open air ride with our buses. I mean, if you guys are curious, I think Google knows the answer.
Nice. And we'll dive into many of the things that you touched upon, the verticalization, the sort of entering a regulated market, etc. But just briefly on COVID and sort of the impact that it has on your business today. And then we'll actually gonna finish off the end of the interview with sort of a future outlook on bus travel and travel in general. On COVID, do you remember the first meeting that you had that was specifically addressing the COVID crisis for your business? Can you walk us through when and where and what you discussed?
Yeah, I think where is not the question any longer with us, as we used to be a very not only international but also a distributed company already before COVID. So it was more or less a virtual war room where we brought together all the relevant people in order to decide how we react. And that was early February. I think we observed that quite a bit in our data, as we're a very data-driven company. We saw some minor effects already earlier. I just watched back then from New Zealand, as I took almost 4 weeks off for parental leave. And when I come back, that was said early February, we started to have those regularly touch points to observe how Italy, and particularly France, were moving on COVID. And we were preparing and adjusting a bit. And then suddenly, that was rather mid-February, end of February, suddenly we had those daily meetings where we also finally decided to shut down almost our entire network when Europe decided to go on that hard lockdown from March ongoing. And I mean, it was, these meetings were a little bit, I don't know, like in a movie, not in a good one, of course, because it's unrealistic. Usually you put all the efforts to grow your business, to make your customers happy, to really manage to move as many of them across the globe, and then suddenly you have to decide to really shut down overnight. And a week later, we also had to, or we decided to basically send everybody home with our colleagues, and close down our offices in order to disinfect them, as we weren't sure if some of our people may even had COVID. And those scenarios where I don't know, you just functioned as you knew from day one it's serious, but it always at night when I was back at home, I kind of recapped as it would have been a movie, because it was so surrealistic partly. And yeah, I have to admit that I'm super proud on our team, and our partners and everything. Not only that everybody had to carry quite something on their shoulders, talking about Kurzarbeit and all the effects we've had throughout being hit as a mobility company by COVID. But what I'm really impressed on was how fast we were able to react in order to adjust our services, which was particularly important to save our people and to avoid any spreading, and which was also commercially super important in order to shrink the variable costs as fast and as high as we were able to. And in those meetings, we just decided who is responsible for what are the daily attributes we talk about, what are the reporting points we are concluding every other night, and just tracking that we really are as fast as we can to protect a driver, a customer, a colleague, and everybody who has been in touch with Flix.
And that speed, which is so crucial in a moment like that, is that something that you put on yourself as a company, or was there pressure also from regulators and the government, with you being responsible for sort of the passing of so many passengers around Europe? How was the interaction actually with the government in those early days?
From a speed perspective, we were faster, much faster than the government, because, we just had, as I said, our company, our partners, our customers at mind. And we just decided, as we saw drops, and we usually have a booking curve in advance, right? So you see also the drops in advance and people start to cancel. So therefore we were faster than governments. And initially we had some funny conversations. I mean, when we thought we had COVID impact on our buses, I remember one night where we thought we had one coming from Eastern Europe and having an exchange in Munich down to, I think it was Milan. And then we called the officials and they were like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what you're doing. And we're like, I think we would disinfect the bus and maybe shut it down. And then we just, I don't know if we can't hand off to the officials all the data, because of nobody really knew what's about GDPR and that stuff. And then they were like, we don't know. And the guys who know are already, off today, because it was after 5 p.m. and we're like, so I don't know if the virus cares about, working time. And then we literally ended up calling the fire department in Karlsruhe to support us shutting down the bus and moving the people different and dealing with addresses and all the regulations. That was, to a certain extent, even funny, because back then the officials haven't been as prepared as they are nowadays. Good thing, though.
And as a reader of, in some ways, of course, our business is effective, but, obviously on a much smaller scale. But, having followed throughout the month the developments, also sort of the scientific understanding that the world has and is still developing on the pandemic, I wonder, what is your current outlook? Not future outlook, because we'll speak about the future, but more for your business today, and maybe talk us through some of the safety concepts you have in place. And then particularly what I'd be interested in is sort of your own mechanism of researching things like aerosol transmission, right? Where Christian Drosten, one of the leading scientists we have in Germany on the topic, has already for 2-3 months in his podcast said that aerosol transmission is totally underestimated in the public discourse, that we have as a world overestimated the impact of surface transmission, hand cleaning and disinfecting everything, and that this is now, in his understanding and his latest research, an overestimation of the risk, whereas aerosol transmission has been underestimated. And I guess aerosol transmission is something that for bus travel is of crucial importance. So I wonder, what's your mechanism actually of staying up to date? Who do you read? How do you follow? How do you wait for the government, even though maybe the government is often later than somebody like Christian Drosten, who's been warning of aerosol transmission for months already?
So I think as a responsible company, you can't wait for the government. But you always have to watch closely the government, because especially in mobility, you're under still quite some regulatory, so you can't do whatever you want. That's the first thing. On the other hand, I think Google News, for instance, having certain newsletters, listening to podcasts, and at night here and there having some TV talk rounds to observe, and just making yourself familiar with daily press. This is a standard exercise, which is even more important in these scenarios as in COVID. But that's something every executive or entrepreneur I would encourage to do. So, and that's also what we do. And we have regular discourses with our bus partners who are more familiar with all the operations in the buses. And we have our own department of quality assurance and things like that, who come up with measures and came up already in advance of the government. In terms of that underestimation you've been pointing out, what we said, even it became regulatory in the aviation, is everybody who just boards a Flixbus, not only during the process of boarding, but particularly also throughout the entire ride, has to wear a mask, because that's something which really comes with that estimation challenge. That in the beginning, nobody was sure if wearing a mask is a proper defense against COVID, and it seems it is. And therefore, even though the officials came to the conclusion, hey, masks is a good idea, we not only encourage but basically enforce everybody who is using our services to wear a mask. And the good thing is we from day one on take that information also to the booking channels and to all the channels we discuss stuff with our customers with, so they know in advance they have to bring a mask. Of course, for certain exceptions, we'll have masks on board to cover those cases. But basically, everybody who books a ticket knows during the booking process there's a mask needed, and they're encouraged to wear the mask during the boarding process and while they're riding. We also limited the boarding process to just one door, so we can make sure it's really following these hygienic rules. Also, the physical distancing. And we disinfect our buses, do not clean them only, as we did always, but we disinfect them regularly after any ride. And we have throughout all the buses also hand sanitizer and stuff to really make sure people have all the possibility to stay healthy. And as I said, we enforce that on the one hand before any government came up with any regulation, and now we also follow certain regulations. So some governments need us to inform people in advance that they check boxes that they have no symptoms of COVID. Other governments have regulatory that buses, trains, or airplanes have just a certain capacity it can fill up to. And that's like changing, of course, which means it's not only what we need to do in the beginning to really adjust ourselves to the lockdown, but now we have to regularly adjust to local spreads or certain local regulatory changing. But underlying, it's most important that everybody wears masks and keeps a sufficient distance, and especially the mask thing points out very, very much exactly what Krauss is pointing to in his recent podcast, I think.
And then from a financial perspective, I guess there is the thing of cost saving, right? That any company at the moment, but particularly companies that have an inherent business affected by the COVID crisis, there is the health of the passengers. There's sort of the future vision and the business plan that you have as founders that you've presented to your investors, that probably you don't have a section on a black swan like the pandemic. How is it from a financial perspective as a company, also in light of fundraising, when the future is so unknown? What's your general sort of philosophical stance there? Is it to be extra conservative, to just try to be agile, or is it to invest into setting, the sort of the pillars for the future post-pandemic?
So first of all, I'm not sure if the pandemic has been a black swan, because I mean, as we as humans really do everything to screw up our planet, whether it's a nature catastrophe in terms of storms or anything, or this time it's a pandemic. That we knew that these things were coming, and it's not going to be the last time. First of all, that means as a company, you really have to be agile, independent of preparing for these kind of scenarios or also for a positive scenario, because there are always opportunities out there which you have to compare, to prioritize for, and to really be agile in order to grab the best ones for you and your company. And yes, cost is something which is in these scenarios, particularly the COVID situation within mobility, eventually having ground your fleet, super important. But most important is the thing you mentioned already. Most important is the safety of security of our passengers, of our drivers, of our employees. And then, as a second thing, the economical safety of our partners in our company is also important. And therefore, I think being very reactive and quickly, we pointed out that already, but also being very conservative is important. So when we had to shut down the entire fleet, we obviously had to revise our business plan. And we made kind of a special COVID budget for this year, which is obviously lower as we used to plan. And therefore, you also have to lower your cost in order to make sure you have enough cash to move on. And that's what we did. And if you are conservative, you eventually can, under-promise and over-deliver, which is always a good thing. And you always make sure that you really know the absolute bottom, basically, of your cash. Because you pointed out funding. I mean, funding, yes, of course, you want to be a highly growing and profitable company, but at the end, cash is the point which you need if you go for funding. And that's something we tried to preserve when we reacted that quickly. We reduced our variable cost. We went in a renegotiation with all of our suppliers, especially the large ones like Google, Amazon, Microsoft. We leveraged certain labor market tools we had in hand in all the countries where they applied, like short-time working. And the reason for that is to preserve our cash. And therefore, we are in a lucky scenario that we don't need to do any racing right now. I think if I would have been forced to race, basically what I think I read in the news, Nareen did recently, the founder of Omio, is a convertible loan, so you can kind of bridge it to the future, where you have a little bit more certainty again, because that's the challenge. It's not the challenge that you eventually currently have a lower revenue or anything, right? If you were able to be agile and adjust your costs, all good. But the uncertainty is what usually bothers investors. And I think, therefore, those kind of financing vehicles like convertibles are, if you would have to finance, the way to go for these days, I guess, until we know when a vaccine is there and when, kind of more or less standard behavior can come.
Great. So we'll go to the second section of the interview, which is more on Flixbus, your kind of path and challenges and learnings in building the business. I saw that, you on your website actually have a saying, and I just read it out loud. It says, "Thanks to a unique business model in innovative technology, the startup has quickly established Europe's largest long-distance bus network." Me as a sort of a consumer, without, let's say, diving deep into the actual business model, I've talked to some friends before this interview. I think for many it's a little bit unclear what is actually Flixbus doing in this value chain.
What do you need? I mean, you go buses and trains. What's the fucking second?
Exactly. And what is actually Flixbus? And then there's the partner network, but then the buses are branded as Flixbus. And here you talk about a unique business model. Maybe you can just explain a little bit what it is
Sure.
that makes it unique.
So, couple things. First of all, I think we have been the only mobility and transportation company whoever started its services based on the demand. Usually travel, particularly long distance perspective, it had been or it has been served by government owned companies. And they usually don't care so much about the demand. They just put service out there. They just put an offer out there. And you can do so, but it's not the most cost-efficient thingy. And if cost-efficient on a privately played company is relevant in order to get the best price to your customers, you better understand where to drive. If it is buses or trains, doesn't really matter. Therefore, we really started off with understanding the demand across Germany and Europe, which is already, doesn't sound like that, pretty unique in transportation, first of all. Second, we really thought what we can do well and what is already out there and done pretty good. And I think we understood exactly that data approach, understanding the demand pretty good. And we also understood quickly certain processes. And together with that understanding, we created the ability to create good software around that to make that super lean and super fast. But we decided that with in Germany at least more than 4,000 small and medium-sized bus companies doing that service for decades already, they really know how to drive a bus successfully and especially safely from A to B. And that's the same for train services, of course. And therefore, what we did is we started running around Germany for almost a year and convincing our partners in order to do that business together with us. And that means they contribute on the operational service, and we share the revenue. So that is, kind of a co-entrepreneurial business model, and that is unique. Or back then, it had been unique in Germany. Particularly, we didn't have that. There was only either a supplier relationship, or you just owned your buses or trains or planes yourself as the large government-owned or corporate players. But that co-entrepreneurial model, the partnership model, used to be unique as well. And the third thing, the third pillar I touch base on is something you don't see from the outside. The largest individual organization or sub-organization at Flix is FlixTech. I'm taking care of, which is more than 250 techies in 4 locations, building the software to run that entire platform, that network properly. And that starts from understanding the demand and suggesting and creating certain schedules, exchanging it with the officials, and then finding out not only from where to where people drive, but what kind of certain price level they're willing to pay. And then throughout the different sales channels, whether it's the apps, it's our web shop, it's our agency partners, it's even the bus driver, to really reduce any obstacle in order to get a bus or a train ticket or Flix if you want some. And last but not least, I mean, imagine we have been discussed as not only as an innovator but also as a disruptor, because back then what we did is we brought internet to the buses. Yes, I know Wi-Fi is still an improvement area, and we're continuously working on that. But at least we've been the only ones back then who did that. I mean, meanwhile, yeah, there are some train companies who also offer that as well. Yeah. 2013, the Flixbus was the only way of traveling to have internet. And I know back then, and I think it's still the case, there are cars chasing down the buses and running behind them in order to get some internet. And it's the same with the information policy. Also there, in terms of customer service, I know we're not perfect yet, and I'm also responsible for customer service, and my people and I work our ass off to make that better, particularly in those challenging situations like in COVID, where things change regularly and we have to adjust, and then some lines are being canceled and we have to rebook stuff. So customer service is super important to us, and one of the most important things is to know if your bus is delayed or no. And these kind of real-time delay information, that's something we came out way before other airlines or train companies had the idea to do so. So these kind of things, it's all a software, it's a technology play, and that's something which we basically brought to the long-distance ground transportation, or sometimes also to the long-distance transportation business at all, like to its market basically. and pushed our incumbents, and that's what makes our the third pillar, basically what makes our business model unique.
And just a brief follow-up in two parts on that question. I guess in a regulated market that then was deregulated, another choice for you guys could have been, and I wonder if you had thought about it, most likely you did, and whether what were the reasons basically to not follow that model, which would be to just have an aggregating search platform, right, for all these individual bus routes that were popping up or that already existed. So something like Omeo from Berlin, another travel unicorn in the making. And secondly, when you then did decide, no, we actually want to vertically integrate, we want to sort of co-own more of the value chain, you discussed how you went throughout Germany and spoke to the individual bus companies. I don't know anything about the bus travel industry, but I would imagine that this is a really tough pitch because you have maybe a local bus company. They've been doing this for 20, 30, 50 years. And they were like, why should we do this with you? The market is deregulating. We can offer more routes. We actually have the demand already, because you were saying, well, you will be able, or you are as Flixbus able to sort of offer more travel on demand. But if you offer it via the partners, maybe the partners told you, well, actually, we can do that. We have the demand ourselves. What were those conversations like, and what was the really killer argument here?
Couple thoughts on that. I mean, there are like thousands of anecdotes to share when we went around Germany, but the precise answer, how difficult it was for all of you guys who are familiar with e-commerce, I think conversion rate is something everybody knows. So as I said, there are more than 4,000 players, and back then we decided to purchase a little database like Gelbe Seiten, Yellow Pages, right, with all those bus companies, more than 4,000. We created emails and even letters and called them, and then we took those journeys across Germany. And at the end of those more than 4,000, we had 7. We were able to convince to come up with about 30 buses in the beginning. So if you calculate in your mind and come up with a conversion rate, and you would run or start an e-commerce rate and come and see me as an investor and tell me about that conversion rate, I probably would say, well, maybe you think of something different. So that is how hard it was. And we just truly believed we can do that. And the reason, and also why we were able to convince, is because we always thought it's not only the price. It's that you need to understand the customer. And the customer, in our case, especially in the beginning, was rather younger people. And that's not necessarily what those companies were familiar with. So we have to put the customer in the middle first. Second, and I was pointing out the demand thing already, that we were really looking to understand what the demand is. And that means we from day one on had the strategy to build a German-wide or even Europe or global-wide inventory, as you said, which is searchable through one single platform. And even these days, it's train and buses. And that means we really wanted to integrate that, because we thought it's about the demand. And if you don't have a powerful enough sales platform, you may not be able to not only understand the demand, but to create even more and put that into your funnel, onto your page. So that is also one of the reasons why all those regional train players we saw over the last 10 years always died, because they only focused on regional and were not able to create enough demand to have a high enough occupancy. And there is coming, sorry.
Hey.
To have a high enough occupancy. And that means we focused on that and had the belief that the inventory is the key. That's very similar to Amazon. Meanwhile, everybody goes to Amazon. In the beginning, everybody looked up in Google what they would like to buy, and Amazon is that powerful, not because they're the cheapest. They aren't for a long time, but they have literally every piece you need, and therefore the inventory is the key. And that was something we really tried to tell the partners. You're just a regional player. You're very good in what you're doing, but you can't afford a global inventory where everybody who wants to go from Hamburg to Berlin, but also who wants to go from Nuremberg to Würzburg, gets a proper ride. And that's what we pitched, and that's where we won. And the last question you raised in regards of the vertical integration, well, we think at the end there is something where you have to serve value. Can you maybe change your diapers, baby, because you smell a little? Yeah. So sorry. So it's you have to serve a certain value. I mean, there's a technical discussion around blockchain, and maybe you at one point need no central platform any longer because it's all working through blockchain and all that stuff. Fair enough, not quite sure if this is the exact explanation, but there is a truth that every platform, beside a brand which appeals to us, needs to create some value. And many of those meta platforms don't create any value. Some of them maybe even, I don't know, overran by Google. You've seen that in slides, you've seen that in hotels. And therefore, I think having your own inventory and being able to control that, to decide where people goes, to decide how to model the demand properly, is something where I can create value. And at the end, I also feel responsible for really moving our people and making them satisfied with our service, and not just, selling a ticket and then I'm off hands. Yes, that creates more challenges. We touch point on service any longer, but that also creates value I can stand up for, and it's kind of long lasting. And I think that's the reason we vertically integrated, and that's the reason we are not just another Uber or another meta search platform like Omio, but really trying to create a good product, which is from the experience of looking it up and booking it until the experience you leave our buses or trains very well.
Two questions on sort of entrepreneurship and your sort of path, because you are also part of Unternehmertum, correct? And sort of a university program, for those who don't know, in Munich, Professor Schimberger, who's built a really tremendous program and entrepreneurship center in Munich. Would you say entrepreneurship is nature or is it nurture? How much of it can be learned?
I think the executional path, what also maybe is differences to a certain extent from leadership to management. The executional path can be learned. That's nurture, particularly if you have some, cultural aspects to us. And there, of course, are differences between Germany and the US, for example. But the willingness to take the risk, the willingness to a certain extent to really give up your life or exchange it in parts of your company, and that continuous flow of energy and risk taking, I'm not quite sure if this can be nurtured. A certain extent, I think, is nature. We have so many great and super responsible jobs and occupations out there. Unfortunately, they're not always valued the same. And we have seen through the pandemic that nurses or the folks working at grocery are as important as super senior software engineers. It depends on the scenario. And we obviously need people who take care of all of those facets. I think entrepreneurship is particularly important because, to my personal opinion, it really drives innovation. Innovation, especially in companies like Germany, is the growth driver. We don't have any oil and gas and stuff like that. So that's good. But it's a mixture, and you cannot force yourself to become an entrepreneur if you don't have, that certain feeling to put everything into that exchange. So I gave up parts of my life, but I do that on purpose. I love it. But the rest, the executional path, I also didn't know when I started that. I was in my mid-20s when I started. I had no fucking clue. And that's the openness to be reflective, to want to understand things. And that's, partly going over, as I said already, into the management skills. And that can be nursed. That's execution. The leadership stuff is very close to personality, as well as those core entrepreneurial attributes.
And I have one. It's a great answer, by the way. Thanks for sharing that. And one question I always ask, it's pretty much the only question I always ask everybody I interview, which is, I find, a very critical one for founders, and that is sort of the question around pivoting versus staying the course, right? We are sort of learned from a lot of the success stories from the United States that took a drastic pivot at one point to become a successful business. But then on the other hand, we also have all these stories where people will tell you 10 years later, well, I had to stay the course, I had that vision, and it took a long time and against all odds, but here we are in success. Have you come across moments where you guys had to ask yourself that question, how much to iterate and experiment further versus to also just stick to the gut and keep on going with an intuition?
The truth is, we do that continuously. The intuition we have is our vision to bring green and smart mobility to everyone to experience the world. How to do that? I think we came up with a great business model. But those scenarios like COVID always force you to reiterate, to rethink at least if this is the right one. If someone tells you that's always how I imagined it and I follow it, I mean, yeah, the war stories looking back are always good for books and sound like that. This is not the truth. And I think this is also not how you want it to be, because then it eventually gets boring way faster than it actually does. And therefore, pivoting and doing things different or adjusting your business model, it's not even something bad. To learn that and to create the ability is something great. If nowadays young entrepreneurs ask us to become shareholders, to invest in their companies, we first of all look at the market. Is there a market for a certain idea, for a certain vision and a certain product? Is there a market, or is that just all right? 9, okay. Is that just an idea of yourself and myself? And if your need is satisfied and my need is satisfied, and maybe Henry's need, that's the name of my little one, then it could be the greatest idea in the world. Doesn't really matter. So market is everything, and that means you understand your customer and you do some number crunching if it's large enough, that is so-called total addressable market first. Second, and that becomes that mixture of good people in certain skill areas, good management, ultimately good leadership and good entrepreneurship. It's the fucking, like my press lady always says I should not, doesn't matter.
Here's fine.
The fucking team. The team is everything. If the team believes they can do, if they found a great market, if they put everything on the scale to execute, infinitely, and if this is given, well, if there comes an obstacle and a need to pivot, so what, right? They really have to keep on. They keep in your minds the customers they want to address, the product and the services they envision, and the market. And if it remains there, because market can change, of course, the Nokia story and stuff. And then pivoting is it's nothing bad. I think it's particularly good. And at the end, if someone tells like I always envision it like that, I don't know. I mean, come on, it's just good for growth.
Got it. Thanks so much. We have 3 more questions on the future of travel now. We're going into the last section of the interview. You guys at Flixbus, you've done a lot of green initiatives. You're sort of at the forefront, in travel when it comes to that, offering carbon offsetting for the trips, trialing buses with solar panels. You also have experience in deploying the first ever electric buses on a long distance line between San Francisco and Sacramento, and now announced plans for the first fuel cell powered long distance buses. So that's, of course, really interesting and polarizing question. So what's your bet here? Are you betting on both fuel cell and electric, or will you say that for long distance travel, the fuel cell may actually have the upper hand?
Exactly. The question depends on if you only ask me as a long distance ground transportation company, or if you ask me as a techie being interested in all those future technologies and human being. And the truth is, looking back at combustion engines, the only good thing about an automotor or even diesel, doesn't really matter, is it was one fits all. It doesn't really matter if you ride 1 kilometer or 100. And the challenge with those new technologies, which have been decomposed to certain use cases, is it's not the case any longer. One quits all. So, and that's also the challenge the politicians currently have with their regulations. It's they really try to understand. Okay, we need some regenerative, powertrains and engines and all that stuff, and somehow because those dudes around Tesla, they come up with the battery powered e-motor, and that's what we go for. And if you then say, well, that's not only the case for everything, they're like, but then we can't really decompose it. We don't get it. It's just why isn't it one fits all anymore as it used to be? And that's the answer, I think, which will become true. It depends on the use case. So for certain inner city services and distances up to whatever 500 kilometers, totally fine. Battery powered e-mobility is awesome, and maybe that range is going to be extended if we are going to see new battery technology. Not quite sure what the proper English term is. Feststoffbatterien. It's even in German a really awful name, but not lithium ion or polymer batteries anymore, but with different chemicals attached, so to say. And if this comes, we'll see eventually more range. But at the end, if it's even more range in the thousands of kilometers or millions as our buses run, well, and that eventually is much more tailored to a fuel cell. Because the fuel cell has the challenge to be cooled as hydrogen has to be cooled, and if you only do 1 kilometer every other week, well, cooling may be a challenge. If you run as often and as long as we do, that's just easier to store and more maybe in that case a better solution. And one example why I keep on smiling still on those initiatives like the Tesla truck or Nikola. Awesome companies. But with that technology of batteries, those trucks will be as heavy that without any load, they cannot pass any bridge in Germany. So that's how hilarious it is. Or if I just put these batteries into our buses, you cannot take more than your laptop case any longer, right? So that's what has to be solved. And maybe batteries get it good, don't know. Until then, I think fuel cell is a very suitable case. And I think if we continue also the R&D in fuel cell, that'll become just another solution for alternative engines in vehicles. And then you have to decide what use case you have. I mean, maybe if you look at other things like I don't know, trains. If it's a high capacity thingy, it's a high speed and high capacity thingy. Trains could be as good as well. And then you don't talk about trucks or buses any longer, but trains. And then it depends also whether it's battery driven or not necessarily battery driven, but electricity driven. If the electricity is been produced green, of course, as well, regenerative. And that's also true for different other scenarios, maybe within the city or even those hyperloop cases. So it'll depend from use case to use case, and it's certainly not only battery powered e-mobility.
And then my final question on sort of the future of travel. It seems almost, I mean, I haven't been around for so long, but it almost seems that in the 60s, many parts of travel were way more comfortable, and in the 80s, even faster, right? You would get to the...
You've been around in the 60s? Not really. Have you? All right.
No. All right. But I'm, I hear stories. I have a little Pan Am old vintage bag from the planes, and everything looked very sort of comfortable and luxurious back then, and even faster, right, with the Concorde travel to the United States. Maybe not, as sustainable, and definitely more privileged and not, not accessible in such a democratic way. But how do you envision the future of travel? Like, will we also have more comfortable travel, or is price really king that defines everything, and the seats will get ever smaller for the passenger? And maybe just an outlook on when we'll expect the first autonomous buses at Flixbus.
I take the autonomous question first. It's just easier. The other one is interesting, but it's a tough one. In terms of autonomy, first, we do not have to wait for level 5. Not necessary. There is cool stuff combining level 3 and virtual reality already. Maybe you can see buses as large remote controlled cars. These kind of things we see very early, not necessarily next year, but I guess the year after or until 2025. There are cool technologies around, and that means, on autobahns where it's possible, because we are the human factor, we are the problems to machines. I mean, if you ever have crossed a street with all those bicycles and pedestrians in Berlin, this is not possible for a machine. I mean, what kind of rules do you apply? And therefore, on autobahns, easy. And that, I think, we can deliver very quickly. And then, imagine if the buses leave the autobahn, they'll be taken over by a remote-controlled driver and then just brought to the next stop, which is awesome, because then people on the bus can really serve the customer's need. And one of the greatest and hardest jobs I meanwhile know, a bus driver, will have an easier job, because he may stay at home and just take a cup of coffee and then control one bus, and eventually has to deal with his little one, and then take the joystick again. So these kind of things we'll see way earlier, until level 5, and I'm really hoping that we at least see prototypes until 2025. And then the regulatory play comes into game again, and we'll see until when we see really a broad adoption of that. The question you asked earlier in terms of luxury. So first of all, this we try regularly. We regularly keep trying certain services. We give a second seat for free, sleeper buses, all that stuff. Some of that, again, regularly. Some of that the people do not want to pay for. We must not forget that travel was way more expensive back then. It was luxury, so therefore you also got luxury. And now it's commodity. I mean, you see all the complaints, if I can't go over the weekend to Mallorca because it's restricted again. Those complaints, it's not a luxury to go to Mallorca over the weekend. This is commodity. And commodity is standardized. It's good, but again, not luxury any longer. And I think what we serve is commodity. We like to have high quality, and especially high safety and security. And this is something increased. The average quality has increased. The safety and security you mentioned the Concorde has increased dramatically. But what also has increased, and what determines a little bit of how modern vehicles, whether it's buses, trains, or airplanes, are structured, is the pure amount of people wanting to travel. It's almost, people consider it as a human right to be mobile and to travel, and it's part of our wish, and so we love it. But that means, we just need to make sure people at the end get from A to B safely, securely, and as comfortable as possible. But if there is not a willingness to overpay, some do. There's still first class at some airlines, and we won't see that any longer, because it's commodity, And imagine back in the centuries, at some point it was luxury to turn your lights on back on without having to light on a fire. Meanwhile, nobody's questioning electricity. You go home, you switch on the lights on, right? But it's nothing special any longer. It's just to do. And I think travel is the same. So I'm afraid the only reason we'll see scenarios like in the 60s again will be reasons I don't like. For instance, if parts of our society have to suffer because of all those measures against COVID, because of all those misalignments in our economy and how it works, right? If so to say, the scissors go apart anymore, that may lead to more luxury, but unfortunately only on the one leg of the scissor. On the other leg, no. And I'd rather have closer legs of the scissors and more commodity traveling and not as much luxury, but for everyone, a possibility
more accessible.
To see his or her beliefs, or to really also uncover new cities, new countries, because at the end, that will reduce the bad things like racism, and it's the only thing which may cost the money, even though it's not luxury and not expensive, but will make us richer in experiences.
Thanks so much. We have 2 questions from the audience, and this is sort of one more chance for the audience to ask questions. There's the Ask a Question section. We'll do a fire set of questions then for Daniel. My final question is one on sort of, we've seen Henry, we've gotten introduced, and maybe in 15 years or maybe in 10 years, you'll sit down with Henry and you'll discuss sort of this time, this year, this crisis, this pandemic, the first big crisis of our generation of that magnitude. What will you tell them were your learnings? What have been sort of the key takeaways for you as a business person, as a family man, as a human being?
First of all, what I learned for myself and I'm going to tell him is we have to stay calm. If you don't stay calm and you get nervous and you start running headless around, right, it's very unlikely to come up with solutions and do things better. And I think, especially in the beginning, where we didn't know what comes across with COVID, that was the reaction, and that led to not coordinated efforts across Germany, across Europe, across the entire world, and that certainly made things worse. So staying calm and not only running for your own is what really is important. And at the end, well, health and our personal human safety is important. It's not only that I want to stay healthy and safe. If this is the case, well, then I have to make sure that others have the ability as well. So that means, yes, maybe I don't like masks. So what? This is very simple. So don't put the efforts to argue against the simple measures. Just put your thoughts together and really look in the future how we eventually can even prevent these things happening again. But at the end, it's important to stay calm and not freak out. And well, what I also learned, and which really I can't even find words of all those metal hats. So awkward theory follows. Usually the easy things, the obvious things are the ones you go for also as a businessman. To think of the most complicated models and whatever could be thought behind, and no. Many and most of the people, and that is true for the people as customers, as investors, but also as part of your society, they're not necessarily ultimately bad and want to rule the world. This is just bullshit. So that's again what comes down to just stay calm and try to do the right thing, and that's independent if we're in a great period or if we have to deal with things like COVID.
Thanks, Daniel. So the 2 audience questions. One is, how can Flixbus ensure its unique business model cannot be copied by new competitors?
If you remember, you asked earlier why we vertically integrate. I think when we did that, that was not part of the original decision. So we do that because of that. But it turns out that this is one of the uniquenesses which prevents others. So imagine you have a very dense network and you have a good relationship with your partners, and that's across Europe. It's not that easy to come up with a capacity. And the capacity is needed to build exactly the inventory I was talking about. So understanding demand, this others have learned meanwhile, fair. But then you need the capacity to serve. And it's not that easy to build the capacity unless you just say, okay, those Flixbus people have a couple thousand buses. Well, let's just buy them and operate them. You can do, but there is almost no other company who is willing to take that invest, because it's all CapEx. It's not around serving the customer, doing good maintenance, doing good marketing and service. It's just around CapEx, maintaining the buses, having them on your balance sheet and doing nothing, apparently. And usually no investor, independent if it's a corporate, listed or private, is willing to give you the money. So the risk to do that on your own is tremendous. And the possibility to do that in a network model are not as great, because we really not only care about our customers, but also our partners. And that means the entry barrier we have created throughout the vertical integration is as high that we feel very comfortable. Nevertheless, we always observe the market and look for competition. We like competition, but we also like to win over competition. And therefore, well, it's not that we stand still. We pivoting is part of our DNA, and questioning ourselves, okay, how do we adjust?
And last audience question, will Flixtrain expand network radar than, I think it's a typo in the question, but the question is basically whether trains will be the only sort of horizontal development that you are planning, or will next to buses and trains, will there be new and other areas you'll enter?
Bus will remain the core, and as long as we have that great opportunities to grow international, we will do. But train is truly our largest strategic lever aside of that. So you'll certainly see more trains over the next years, not only in Germany, but also across Europe and wherever it's possible and sufficient. Because what we try to do is we try to really make sure to understand where a train is better than a bus. The only thing what can beat a cheap bus which does a great service is a cheap train which does a great service. Why? Because it's a little bit faster, it's a little bit more comfortable, but it's just a little bit more expensive. And if you do that properly with the demand management and the load factor, well, you can run it very cheap and can transport much more people. I mean, you'd need, I don't know, 10 double deckers for the train we run between Cologne and Hamburg, for instance. And for those particular routes, if we find them out, not only, as I said, across Germany, but Europe, maybe even the entire world, we will switch into trains and buy a complementary product where we can connect as many destinations as possible with the best mode of transportation. And therefore, this is the second largest strategic lever. And yes, we will certainly see more trains. It may go a little slower because it's not that easy to buy a train. It takes a little longer, and the regulatory is still challenging, but we take it on.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. I know we've gone a little bit over time. I want to thank Yasu, Jing, and everybody for interactive participation and the questions, and all the attendees for tuning in. Daniel, thanks for your time, and also to Henry for popping in and saying hello to us.
Thank you very much.
All the best and good luck for
thanks for having me, and everybody enjoy the weekend.